Hello and welcome to our review of The Night the Bed Fell by James Thurber. James Thurber is an author and a cartoonist. All of these drawings here that represent characters are actually his drawings that I just pulled from the internet. They're not necessarily related to the story. This one is, however, but I just thought that they would make a nice little visual using the authors and cartoonists' drawings. So this, The Night the Bed Fell, was written in 1933. It's an autobiographical short story. So autobiographical would mean that it's his own life. It's actually true. This is his version of what happened the night the bed fell. Basically, there's this misunderstanding. So misunderstandings and self-absorbed behavior and thinking can cause fears to heighten. So things that people were already worried about went kind of crazy. And then there's some funny things that happen, and there are these hilarious outcomes at the end of the story. So the author's purpose is to entertain. He's not just narrating. He's not just telling a story. He wants to entertain. So let's take a quick look. The Night the Bed Fell. It starts off with, I suppose that the high water mark of my youth in Columbus, Ohio, was the night the bed fell on my father. So we start off with the narrator, so I, meaning James Thurber, basically. We know it's autobiographical. So the narrator is I, and then the night the bed fell on my father. So here's the father in that bed representing that situation. So he decides one night to sleep up in the attic. And his mother, here she is, says, no, it's wobbly, it's unsafe, there's this heavy headboard and it might crash down on your head and kill you. I don't want you to do that. But you can't dissuade him, and he decides, I think it was 10:15, that he is going to go into the attic and sleep. So he goes up there, and then the author, the narrator here, starts talking about his grandfather. Well, his grandfather usually sleeps up in the attic, and his grandfather is depicted by two Civil War generals because the grandfather would leave for 6 to 8 days at a time, and then he would come back growling, talking with his grouchy temper, talking about the Civil War as if the Civil War were going on right now. Remember, this is 1933, so we know the Civil War is not actually happening. So he's kind of a kooky grandfather. So the grandfather usually sleeps in this bed, but this night, the father says, I'm going to go try sleeping up in that bed, and the mom's not happy about it. So next, visiting them at this time is the narrator's first cousin, Briggs Beale. He calls him a nervous first cousin. He has this little thing where he thinks that at night, if he doesn't wake up every hour, he's going to suffocate and die. So the narrator tells him, hey, don't worry, I'm a really light sleeper, and I will wake you up if I hear that you stop breathing. And that first night, Briggs Beale decides to test him. And the narrator thought, he's probably going to test me. And so he pretends to fall asleep, and he makes his breathing nice and even, so he sounds like he's sleeping. And then Briggs Beale holds his breath to try and see if he'll wake up. And he right away wakes up, and everything's fine. There is this thing that he does. He uses camphor. Spirits of camphor. It's if you've ever used Vicks Vapor Rub, it's very strong, this medicinal smell, for him to smell and wake himself up. So he uses camphor to kind of wake himself up with a little sniff of this which we know is Vicks Vapor Rub. It has camphor in it. Then he starts talking about Briggs Beale's mother, his aunt. So he talks about his 3 aunts. The first aunt he talks about, Briggs Beale's mom, is Aunt Melissa Beale. Aunt Melissa, he says, old Aunt Melissa, who could whistle like a man with 2 fingers in her mouth, suffered under the premonition that she was destined to die on South High Street. She was born there, she married there, so she thought she was going to die there. She had this kind of kooky feeling. Then Aunt Sarah Schoaf, she went to bed at night thinking that a burglar was going to come in and blow chloroform underneath the door. So chloroform is kind of this sweet-smelling odor, colorless, so sweet-smelling, colorless, like vapor that people used to use it to have people sleep while they went to the dentist or a doctor. And so she thought that burglars were going to put chloroform underneath her door. And so she would take all of her belongings, all of her jewels and her money and her silverware, any valuables, and put it right outside her bedroom door and write a note that says, "This is all I have. Please take it and do not use your chloroform, as this is all I have." So he's got kind of some crazy people in his family. Now let's talk about Aunt Gracie Show. So Aunt Gracie, she also thought burglars were going to come. And she, for 40 years, threw her shoes down the hall and claimed that when she threw her shoes down the hall, that is when that scared them and they went away. So she was kind of crazy too. She would shake her husband and say, wake up, listen. And he learned in 1903 to ignore her. And so poor Aunt Gracie Show just threw all of her shoes down the hall every night, and the husband ignored her. So we know that this narrator has some crazy people in his family. He talks about his grandfather and he talks about his aunts, but then he moves on and says, wait, I'm still trying to tell you a story. And they don't really have that much to do with the story, but he sets us up for this crazy situation. So, during the night that the bed fell on his father, by midnight, everybody's in bed. And he starts describing the situation of where everybody sleeps, because it's important to understand the situation and the layout of the house. So we'll talk about some of these characters when we get there in just a second. So let's look at this as though this is the attic. So we've got the father in the attic. You can see that, okay? So the father's in the attic. Then he says that the mother and his brother Herman were in a room, the front room, right below the father. So we have this situation where we've got Herman the brother and the mother. They're sleeping somehow in the great room, and the father's above them in the attic. So we've got this situation. Then he's in a room with Briggs Beale right next to them. So here's another room right next to them. And then we've got Roy, who's right over here across the hall. And in between them in the hall is Rex the dog. So we're basically attic, front room, the bedroom that's next to this one, the hallway, Roy, and then Rex is in the hallway. These guys aren't in the story anymore until a comment at the very end, and you might remember that. So something else to know is that as everybody's sleeping around midnight, the narrator starts describing that he was sleeping on an army cot. So an army cot is made to sleep on pretty comfortably. You fold it up and everything, but you have to sleep on it in a certain way. If you lean too far to one side, it can fold up. So if you lean, it'll fold up on you and sometimes fall down while you're sleeping on it. And this is exactly what happens and starts this whole chaotic thing. So the narrator falls out of his cot. He's in this deep sleep. So it turns out he lied to Briggs about being a light sleeper, and he's actually a really, really deep sleeper. And so he ends up falling out of the cot, and he rolls onto the floor, and the cot topples over on him. But he was still warmly bundled up in his bed, so he was unhurt, and he didn't wake up. And he just kind of moved and went back to sleep. His mother ends up getting into this crazy state. She woke up from it and she says, let's go to your poor father, and tells Herman that. Well, Herman, that's in the same room with her, thought that she, for no apparent reason, started becoming crazy because he didn't hear what happened with this cot. So he starts yelling, "You're all right, Mama," to calm her down. And then she says, let's go to your poor father. You're all right, Mama. Let's go to your poor father. You're all right, Mama. And they're yelling at each other. Then this starts waking up Briggs. And the narrator is a little bit conscious here in kind of a vague way, but he didn't really realize what was going on. But Briggs woke up to these loud shouts of fear and apprehension. And so he came to the quick conclusion that he was suffocating and they were worried about him. So he thinks all their yelling is about him. And they were all trying to bring him out of his suffocation. So he gets up and with a low moan, he goes to grab his camphor to smell it. But instead of smelling it, he pours it all over himself. And then it was so strong that he really felt like he was suffocating, and it made it really hard for him to breathe. And then he runs over to a window to breathe outside of the window and get some fresh air. But instead of going to an open window, he goes to a closed window and he shatters it open. And the narrator hears the glass fall down into the street below. So he's breathing out the window and it tickles down into the alleyway. And then suddenly the narrator is trying to get up and he's feeling all weird and realizes, oh, the cot's on top of me. And then he starts yelling, get me out of this, get me out. And he's having this nightmare that he was entombed in a mine. Well, then Briggs is gasping. And by this time, Mom is still shouting. And she runs up to the attic. So she's trying to open this door, but the attic door is shut and it won't open. And so she's frantically pulling on the door and banging on the door to get Father awake. And then Father, who was super sound asleep, finally wakes up and starts thinking, oh, I think the house is on fire. And so he starts yelling, I'm coming, I'm coming. And she, the mom, assumes that she thinks he's dying and he's saying, I'm coming, as though he's going toward his maker. He's going toward God. He's going toward the light, or however he thinks he's going to die, however she thinks he's going to die. And she yells, he's dying. And then Briggs thinks that she's still talking about him, and he says, I'm all right, I'm all right. Finally, the narrator finds the light switch, and he starts making his way to the attic door, so they're all kind of at the attic door. They make their way up there to save Father. Well, Rex, who always thinks that Briggs, has never liked Briggs and thinks that Briggs is the one that has caused all of this problem, jumps up on Briggs as they're trying to get Father out. And Roy, the other brother, has decided to throw the dog down the hall and push on him and keep him there to save Briggs. Well, eventually, Roy comes over here and opens the door and Father walks down the stairs. Mom starts crying with relief, and then Rex begins to howl, so and the situation's finally put all back together. Father's saying, what's going on in here? Because he didn't know all what happened. He thought the house was on fire. They figured out like a big puzzle, and Mother says, I'm glad that your grandfather wasn't here. That's the night the bed fell. So the whole thing is supposed to just be this kooky story about James Thurber's family, the night the bed fell on his father.